Operation Mincemeat began not with soldiers, planes, or tanks but with a corpse, a carefully crafted lie, and a desperate need to fool one of the most powerful intelligence machines in the world. In early 1943, the Allies faced a critical challenge. They needed to invade southern Europe to break Hitler's grip, but wherever they struck, casualties would be enormous if the Germans were prepared. The logical invasion point was Sicily, the gateway into the soft underbelly of Europe, a stepping stone from which the Allies could move northward into Italy. But the Germans also knew this. Every map, every strategic analysis pointed to Sicily. The problem was simple: how to convince Hitler that the Allies would not invade the one place they absolutely intended to invade. The solution became one of the strangest, boldest, and most ingenious deception operations in the history of modern warfare. It was named Operation Mincemeat. The roots of the plan began months earlier, inside cramped, smoke-filled rooms of British intelligence offices in London. The war was at a turning point. The Allies had driven the Germans back in North Africa but needed a decisive push into Europe. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted countless messages showing German commanders reinforcing Sicily. British generals and planners knew that unless they misled Hitler, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers could die on the beaches of Sicily. British intelligence had long understood that the Germans trusted documents found on dead men more than intercepted radio transmissions. If they could plant false invasion plans on a body that the Germans would believe to be a drowned British courier, they could manipulate Hitler's entire southern command. The idea was wildly risky. If the Germans realized it was a plant, they might ignore real intelligence or even anticipate the actual invasion. But if they believed it, they would shift their troops away from Sicily, giving the Allies a chance to strike with significantly reduced resistance. The man behind the idea was Ewan Montague, a lawyer-turned-intelligence officer, working within the 20 Committee, which handled deception operations. Working alongside him was Charles Chumley, a tall, eccentric RAF officer known for unconventional thinking. Together they crafted the basis of the plan: find a suitable dead body, give him a complete fake identity, plant false invasion documents on him, and release the body off the coast of Spain, a country officially neutral but filled with German spies. Spain often shared recovered documents with German intelligence, especially if they seemed important. If everything worked perfectly, Hitler would shift forces away from Sicily toward Greece and Sardinia. If the operation failed, the entire Allied invasion of southern Europe could collapse. The next challenge was locating the right body. It had to look like a man who had drowned at sea. It had to be unclaimed, with no family to question his disappearance. After days of searching, British intelligence located the corpse of a homeless man named Glyndwr Michael, who had died after accidentally ingesting rat poison. His death left no family, no claims, no fingerprints on government records. His body became the foundation of the operation. The body was carefully preserved and prepared to appear as if it had died of drowning and hypothermia. The British coroner working with the intelligence team ensured the body's lungs, face, and skin showed signs consistent with a man who had drifted in the ocean for days. Creating an identity for the corpse became the next step. He needed a name, a story, a profession, personal effects, everything a real officer would carry. They named him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a rank high enough to plausibly carry secret papers, but not so high as to raise suspicion. Montague and Chumley crafted a complete life for Major Martin. They filled his pockets with love letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam, bills for dry cleaning, receipts for club dues, a theater ticket stub, and even a stern letter from his father. These small human details were crucial because German intelligence always examined mundane items to judge authenticity. The more ordinary the man seemed, the more believable the deception. But the most important items were the documents he carried in his briefcase. These included intentionally misleading letters between British generals discussing Allied plans to attack Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The documents were carefully worded to sound genuine, but not overly convenient. They were subtle. The deception had to seem accidental, not deliberate. The briefcase was chained to the dead man's wrist, a common practice among couriers carrying sensitive material. Once the identity was complete, British intelligence dressed the corpse in a Royal Marines uniform and placed him inside a specially designed canister packed with dry ice. To maintain secrecy, the canister was labeled as holding delicate optical equipment. No one except a handful of intelligence officers knew the truth. Under the cover of darkness, naval officers transported the canister aboard the submarine HMS Seraph. The submarine crew was told nothing of the body's origin or the operation's purpose. They believed it was a routine delivery. As HMS Seraph approached the coast of Huelva, Spain, a region densely populated with German agents, the tension grew. The Spanish government often cooperated with Germans, turning over documents and bodies recovered from the sea. This was exactly what the British needed. On the night of April 30, 1943, the submarine surfaced. The crew opened the canister, and Montague's men carefully released the body into the cold Mediterranean waters. The body carried the briefcase, the documents, and the fate of an entire invasion. The tide carried the body toward shore. At dawn, Spanish fishermen spotted the corpse floating in the surf and alerted local authorities. A doctor examined the body and declared it a British courier who had drowned. The Spanish military took possession of the body and the briefcase. British diplomats immediately began demanding the return of the documents, pretending to panic, which only increased the Spaniards' curiosity. Meanwhile, German intelligence was informed. Soon, copies of the documents were sent to Berlin. Everything now depended on one question: would Hitler believe the deception? When the documents reached German hands, the real test of Operation Mincemeat began. British intelligence could only wait, watch, and hope that the Germans would believe the carefully crafted deception. In Berlin, the documents were examined by military analysts, codebreakers, and intelligence officers who checked the authenticity of every signature, stamp, and phrasing. The Germans prided themselves on their ability to sniff out British trickery, and for years the Abwehr, Hitler's intelligence organization, had successfully uncovered Allied deception attempts. But this time, the documents seemed too real, too mundane, too human to be fabricated. German intelligence officers believed they had stumbled upon a rare and invaluable treasure, the private invasion plans of the British military, recovered by sheer chance from a drowned courier. The Germans noted the slight water damage, the ink smudges, the paper softness, and concluded the documents had spent days in the sea. That detail alone gave enormous credibility. While the Germans studied the documents, the Spanish government pretended neutrality but quietly allowed German agents studied access. Even better for the British, the Spanish intelligence service was disorganized and corrupt enough that they didn't immediately return the sealed briefcase to British diplomat. This delay gave the Germans ample time to copy everything. British intelligence monitored German radio messages through ultra-decrypts at Bletchley Park. Each decrypted message that mentioned Greece or Sardinia added to the Allies' growing hope that the operation was working. But they still didn't know if Hitler himself would be convinced. Then came the breakthrough. A decrypted message confirmed that the Germans had forwarded copies of the documents to Hitler's staff. The deception reached the highest levels of the Nazi command. As days passed, the British began to sense a shift in German deployment orders. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted increased troop movements toward Greece. Reports indicated that German divisions were being repositioned in the Balkans. The Germans even began reinforcing Sardinia, a location the Allies had no intention of invading. This was precisely the reaction the British wanted. Hitler himself read the documents and was convinced. He firmly believed the Allies would avoid Sicily precisely because it was too obvious. He saw Sicily as a trap, a place where the Allies would want him to expect an invasion, only to strike elsewhere. When the documents suggested Greece and Sardinia as primary targets, Hitler saw it as confirmation of his own intuition. He immediately ordered the transfer of panzer divisions, air units, and infantry away from Sicily and into Greece and the Peloponnese. German generals who doubted the documents were overruled. Hitler's fixation on deception and his distrustful mind made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of trick Operation Mincemeat was designed to exploit. Meanwhile, in London, British intelligence carefully tracked every change. Ultra messages provided a real-time map of German troop movements. Every decrypted report brought new excitement. Adolf Hitler was committing multiple divisions thousands of miles from where they were needed most. The success of Operation Mincemeat had exceeded expectations. Winston Churchill was informed of the plan's success and famously remarked, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." This operation was the ultimate bodyguard. While the Germans moved forces away from Sicily, the Allies prepared for the real invasion. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was one of the largest seaborne invasions in history before D-Day. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were involved. Commanders rehearsed landings, supply logistics, and airborne drop. Yet the most important element was not the size of the force but the element of surprise, achieved only because the Germans had believed a dead man with a briefcase. As the invasion date approached, Allied planners continuously checked ultra-decrypt. All signs confirmed that the Germans were still convinced that Sicily was merely a feint, a distraction from the real invasion in Greece. German commanders on Sicily were denied reinforcements. Their requests for additional men, weapons, and supplies were ignored because Hitler believed the real attack was coming elsewhere. Even when Allied bombers began pounding Sicilian airfields and ports, the Germans assumed it was part of a diversionary tactic. On July 9, 1943, the invasion of Sicily began. Allied troops landed under heavy winds and rough seas, but German defenses were far weaker than expected. Many key positions lacked sufficient troops, heavy artillery, or armored support because the units had already been sent to Greece. The landings succeeded faster than Allied commanders had hoped. Within the first 48 hours, the Allies secured beachheads and captured major positions. German and Italian commanders on Sicily sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin asking for reinforcements. Hitler refused. He was still convinced the main attack was coming on the Greek coast. As the Allies advanced deeper into Sicily, the full impact of Operation Mincemeat became clear. German forces on the island were understrength, undersupplied, and isolated. The deception had worked so thoroughly that the Germans were still preparing for an invasion in Greece even as Sicily was falling. Only after weeks of Allied victories did Hitler finally realize that he had been deceived, but by then it was far too late. The success of the Sicily invasion changed the entire course of the war. Italy, already shaken by military failures and internal divisions, teetered on collapse. Mussolini was removed from power shortly after the fall of Sicily, and Italy eventually surrendered. The Allies gained a gateway into Europe, pushing northward into the Italian mainland. German resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts. All of this had been made possible, at least in part, by Operation Mincemeat, a deception built on a single dead man, a set of fake papers, and a brilliantly executed plan. But while the military triumph was celebrated, the deeper, more human side of the story remained hidden from the public for decades. The corpse used in the operation had belonged to a man who had died alone, forgotten by society. His life had ended in obscurity, yet in death he had played a critical role in shaping world events. For many years, the identity of the man used in Operation Mincemeat remained classified. Even his grave in Huelva, Spain, was marked only with the name Major William Martin, Royal Marines, a man who had never existed. It was not until decades later that historians uncovered the truth. The man who had fooled Hitler was Glyndwr Michael, a homeless Welsh laborer who had lived a life of hardship. His identity was officially recognized long after the war ended, and a new inscription was added to his grave. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. The man who had once died forgotten was now remembered as one of the silent heroes of the war. Operation Mincemeat became one of the most successful deception campaigns in military history. It demonstrated how creativity, psychology, and audacity could defeat armies larger and more powerful than one's own. It showed that wars were not won only by guns and tanks but also by clever minds willing to take bold risks. The operation helped shape the future of intelligence and undercover operations, inspiring generations of spies, analysts, and military planners. As Operation Mincemeat rippled through the German command structure and shaped the fate of the Mediterranean theater, the people who had orchestrated the deception watched events unfold with a tense mixture of hope, disbelief, and mounting satisfaction. But the story of the operation did not end with the invasion of Sicily or even with the shifting tides of war. The aftermath, the unintended consequences, the secret records, the human cost, and the decades-long silence that followed became an inseparable part of its legacy. While newspapers celebrated the rapid fall of Sicily and the collapse of Mussolini's regime, the true architects of the victory worked in shadows, never publicly acknowledged, bound by secrecy and classified orders. The world moved forward while the story of the dead man who fooled Hitler remained locked behind closed doors for almost half a century. In London, intelligence officers observed the ongoing German confusion with a sense of quiet triumph. Ultra-decrypts continued to provide evidence of just how deeply Hitler had taken the bait. Even weeks after the Allies controlled Sicily, German divisions in Greece maintained full alert, expecting landings along the Aegean coastline. Reconnaissance aircraft flew endless patrols over the Peloponnese, and German engineers reinforced fortifications that would never see combat. Hitler's obsession with the false narrative consumed precious resources, fuel, troops, and equipment, weakening German positions in Italy and France. What began as a deception targeting a single invasion had blossomed into a strategic misdirection that reshaped entire fronts of the war. Meanwhile, the British intelligence community navigated the delicate balance of exploiting the deception's success while ensuring that no clues ever surfaced to reveal the truth. They understood that if the Germans discovered that the body had been a plant, any future deception operations would be doomed. The British therefore continued to treat Major William Martin as a real fallen officer. They sent letters to military departments confirming his death, filed casualty reports, and maintained the illusion even within internal bureaucratic channels. Only a handful of individuals inside the 20 committee knew the full truth. Even many intelligence officers who handled the paperwork believed Major Martin had truly died in service. The fiction had become so convincing that it lived as if it were fact. In Spain, the local population knew little of the storm of espionage that had passed through their coastal town. Fishermen who had found the body returned to their quiet routines. Doctors and coroners who examined the corpse wrote official reports fully believing it belonged to a British courier lost at sea. Spanish officers who briefly handled the documents had no idea that the pages they passed along would help shape the course of the war. Even the German agents stationed in Huelva, who congratulated themselves for intercepting valuable intelligence, were unaware that they had been masterfully manipulated. Operation Mincemeat succeeded in large part because every participant, except the British architects, believed they were handling something authentic. It was deception built on layers of truth. As Allied forces pushed north through Italy, the German military faced increasingly dire challenges. The loss of Sicily opened the door to the Italian mainland, leading to prolonged battles that drained German strength on yet another front. Italy surrendered, forcing Germany to occupy the country and fight a defensive war along the brutal Apennine line. Each of these developments traced a thread back to Operation Mincemeat. Without the deception, the Sicily invasion would have faced heavier resistance, slowing the Allied advance, giving Germany more time to fortify Italy, and potentially altering the timeline of the entire European campaign. Yet while the geopolitical consequences were dramatic, the personal stories connected to the operation carried their own emotional weight. In the years after the war, Ewan Montagu returned to civilian life, eventually writing a sanitized version of the story titled, The Man Who Never Was. He published it in 1953 after portions of the operation were declassified. His account revealed some details but omitted the true identity of the corps. He was bound by law not to reveal that information. The book captured public fascination, and soon it was adapted into a film. Audiences around the world were captivated by the tale of a dead man used as a weapon, but they never learned the full truth. For decades, the grave in Huelva bearing the name William Martin became a modest but enduring symbol. Flowers occasionally appeared, placed by British visitors who mourned a man they believed had given his life in service. Spanish locals tended to the grave as part of their cemetery duties, unaware that the name on the stone belonged to a fictional persona. Veterans who had survived the Sicily invasion sometimes paid their respects, believing Major Martin had been one of the many anonymous heroes whose sacrifice had saved thousands of lives. This quiet honoring of a man who never existed became one of the most poignant ironies of the entire operation. As post-war Europe rebuilt itself, historians gradually gained access to classified documents, though key details of Operation Mincemeat remained sealed. The mystery surrounding the identity of the body persisted. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the man had been a drowned sailor. Others believed he was a soldier killed in an air crash. Still others thought he might have been a prisoner or an executed spy. None came close to the truth. British officials deliberately encouraged ambiguity to protect the operation's methods and maintain the dignity of the deceased. Meanwhile, the identity of Glynndwr Michael faded into the background of history. Born into poverty in Wales, he had endured a life marked by hardship and loneliness. His death had passed without ceremony. Yet this same man, unknown in life, had changed the course of the war in death. For decades, however, no one knew his name or his contribution. His story remained buried beneath official secrecy. It was not until the 1980s, when intelligence historian Roger Morgan gained access to previously classified files, that the truth emerged. Documents revealed the name Glynndwr Michael and confirmed that he had been the man used in the operation. His identity was no longer a secret. Historians recognized him as a significant figure in one of the most remarkable deception operations in history. The revelation prompted British officials to update the Huelva grave. A new inscription was added beneath the original name. Glynndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, RM. The fictional officer and the real man were finally acknowledged together, forever linked by the operation that had defined them. As the Cold War unfolded, the lessons of Operation Mincemeat shaped intelligence strategies across the world. Deception became a powerful tool in modern warfare. Nations developed units dedicated to psychological operations, disinformation campaigns, and strategic misinformation. Mincemeat served as a case study in military academies, intelligence courses, and psychological warfare programs. Its success demonstrated that the most effective deceptions were those grounded in human behavior, emotional details, and plausible reality. It was not flashy tricks or wild illusions that fooled Hitler, but small touches. Love letters, theater tickets, bank statements, and the believable imperfections of an ordinary life. Through the decades, more revelations came to light. Files showed the extent of coordination between the British intelligence services, the Royal Navy, the Coroner's Office, and diplomatic channels in Spain. Letters exchanged between Montagu and his colleagues revealed the creativity and pressure behind the planning. Personal diaries of officers involved in the operation described the tension aboard HMS Seraph as they prepared to release the body into the sea. These details enriched the story and highlighted the human ingenuity behind a plan that had once seemed impossible. Yet the emotional gravity of the operation remained tied to the image of that single corpse drifting in the Mediterranean darkness, carrying a briefcase that altered the destiny of nations. The whole operation rested on the hope that a dead man could speak louder than any living spy. And astonishingly, he had. Operation Mincemeat entered history not simply as a clever trick but as a turning point in the war. It demonstrated that intelligence work required imagination and boldness as much as discipline and secrecy. It showed that even the most rigid military systems could be manipulated through carefully constructed narrative. And it proved that sometimes the fate of millions can hinge on the smallest, strangest details: a letter in a pocket, a photograph in a wallet, the name on a dog tag. As time moved forward and the veterans of the war passed into memory, Operation Mincemeat stood as a testament to the creativity and courage of those who never saw the battlefield yet shaped it from the shadows. And as the story continued to unfold through books, documentaries, and declassified files, new generations found in it a reminder of the power of ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. As the years after the war unfolded, Operation Mincemeat evolved from a closely guarded intelligence secret into a symbol of strategic brilliance and quiet heroism. The operation's influence seeped into every corner of military planning, proving that deception, when executed with precision and imagination, could shape the battlefield as powerfully as any army. But while the military significance was clear, the operation carried a deeper human story, one that stretched far beyond war rooms, submarines, and intelligence offices. It became a story about the value of life, the weight of sacrifice, and the strange fate of a man who found purpose in death that he had never known in life. In Britain, the war ended with relief, celebration, and profound loss. Veterans returned home, cities rebuilt, and nations reshaped themselves. But inside the secret corridors of MI5 and MI6, the lessons of Operation Mincemeat became institutional knowledge. Intelligence officers studied how every detail, from a lover's photograph to a bank overdraft letter, had contributed to convincing an entire enemy command structure. Training programs emphasized the power of authenticity, stressing that even the smallest inconsistency could unravel a deception. As new recruits entered the intelligence services, the Mincemeat files became a rite of passage, a reminder that creativity was as essential as discipline. Meanwhile, in military academies across the United States and allied nations, commanders dissected the operation from every angle. They analyzed how the choice of Spain as the drop location exploited political loopholes. They studied the timing, which placed the body precisely when diplomatic tensions would heighten German curiosity. They examined how British signals intelligence supported the deception by monitoring German reactions. These analyses revealed that Operation Mincemeat was not a single act but a tapestry woven from countless threads: psychological insight, diplomatic finesse, intelligence gathering, and daring imagination. As the story slowly became public, writers, journalists, and filmmakers turned it into a legend. But behind the celebrated narrative lay a quieter reality. Many of the operation's architects, including Montague and Chumley, lived with the burden of what they had done, both the pride of success and the emotional weight of using a human body as a tool. They had given the corpse dignity and purpose, but they had still relied on a man who had died unnoticed, whose life had been marked by hardship. Some intelligence officers confessed in private letters that they felt haunted by the idea that Glyndwr Michael, a man who had nearly vanished from history, had been thrust into the center of global events without his consent. Others viewed the operation as an act of redemption, transforming a tragic death into a crucial contribution to the defeat of tyranny. In Spain, the story took on a life of its own. Locals in Huelva spoke of the mysterious British officer who had washed ashore decades earlier. Rumors circulated about spies, submarines, and secret missions. The cemetery where Major Martin was buried became a point of quiet curiosity. Over time, local caretakers tended the grave with care, unaware of its true significance. When the identity of the man beneath the headstone was finally revealed, Spaniards expressed a unique sense of connection. The story had unfolded on their shores, in their town, in their soil. The grave became not only a British memorial but a Spanish one as well, symbolizing the strange ways in which global events can intersect with the lives of ordinary people. In Germany, the discovery that Hitler had been fooled by Operation Mincemeat became a case study in strategic failure. Military historians analyzed how rigid thinking, blind trust in captured documents, and Hitler's increasingly erratic leadership had opened the door to deception. Some German officers admitted after the war that they had doubted the documents but were overruled. Others revealed that they had lacked the time or resources to verify them. The operation illustrated how a single misconception, accepted at the highest levels, could cascade into disastrous strategic decisions. For Germany, it became a symbol of how overconfidence and authoritarian command structures could magnify intelligence mistakes. As the 20th century progressed into a new era of geopolitical uncertainty, Operation Mincemeat continued to hold relevance. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union studied the operation extensively. It influenced propaganda strategies, concealment techniques, and misinformation campaigns. Deception operations became more sophisticated, but the foundational principles remained rooted in the lessons of mincemeat: authenticity, subtlety, emotional realism, and the understanding that human psychology was often the decisive battlefield. With each passing decade, more details emerged from declassified files. Historians found memos that revealed hidden tensions within British intelligence as the operation unfolded. Letters between officers described the anxiety they felt as they waited for confirmation that the Germans had taken the bait. Logs from HMS Seraph showed the solemn mood aboard the submarine before releasing the body. These glimpses into the past added layers of humanity to a story long mythologized. One particularly revealing document uncovered the final hours before the body was released. It described how the commanding officer gathered his men and spoke quietly about the solemn nature of the task. Though they did not know the body's true origin, they understood its strategic importance. They felt the weight of secrecy, the moral complexity, and the eerie responsibility of sending a dead man into the sea with the fate of nations in his pocket. The crew treated the moment almost like a burial, respectful, somber, and deeply aware that they were participating in something extraordinary. There were also personal stories from individuals indirectly touched by the operation. A Spanish fisherman who had discovered the body described how he had prayed over the man, believing he was honoring a fallen soldier. A British diplomat who handled the recovered briefcase wrote years later that he had been terrified of making a mistake that would expose the operation. A German intelligence officer stationed in Madrid recounted how he had celebrated the interception of the documents, unaware that he had fallen into a carefully prepared trap. These personal accounts added depth and texture to the story, reminding later generations that behind the grand sweep of military strategy lay ordinary human beings doing their best in extraordinary circumstances. By the late 20th century, Operation Mincemeat had transitioned from a wartime secret to a staple of intelligence history. Books, documentaries, and classroom lessons brought the story to millions of people. Yet even as it became more widely known, the operation retained an air of mystery, a testament to the creativity and audacity of those who had orchestrated it. The idea that a single corpse could influence the movement of divisions, shape an invasion, and redirect the course of a war continued to capture the imagination. In the 21st century, renewed interest in the operation emerged as declassified files offered fresh details. Scholars revisited the psychological strategies used by British planners, noting how they exploited German expectations and biases. They pointed out how Hitler's own mindset, prone to suspicion, convinced of hidden plots, and fascinated by elaborate feints, made him uniquely vulnerable to mincemeat. The operation had not simply fooled the German military, it had played into the very weaknesses of its leadership. As public interest surged, people became increasingly fascinated by the human story of Glyndwr Michael. Historians and journalists searched for traces of his life, his childhood in Wales, the hardships he endured, the circumstances that led to his lonely death. In many ways, uncovering his story became an act of historical justice. His memory, once destined to fade, became immortalized. His name appeared in museums, books, and articles around the world. He became a symbol of how even a forgotten life could alter the fate of nations. Majestic memorials and elaborate military honors were never part of Glyndwr Michael's life, yet he gained a kind of immortality that few soldiers, generals, or politicians ever achieve. His story resonated deeply because it showed that history is not shaped only by grand figures but sometimes by those who never know their own impact. Operation Mincemeat also became a kind of moral reflection. Historians debated whether the use of a corpse for deception was ethical, even in wartime. Some argued it was a necessary act that saved countless lives. Others grappled with the uncomfortable truth that the man had not consented. The discussion became part of broader conversations about the ethics of espionage, the boundaries of wartime necessity, and the value of human dignity. Yet even in these debates, one fact remained clear: the operation had changed the world. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat stretched far beyond intelligence manuals and historical studies. It influenced popular culture, inspired fictional works about espionage and deception, and shaped the public's understanding of how wars are fought behind the scenes. It demonstrated that intelligence work is as much about imagination as it is about information, and it highlighted that even the smallest details, a handwritten note, a cigarette case, a photograph of a sweetheart, could become weapons in the most consequential war in human history. By the early 21st century, the operation had become a fixture in documentaries, spy museums, and university courses. Visitors stood in front of exhibits displaying replicas of Major Martin's papers, uniforms, and personal belongings. They read about the immense risks taken by Montague, Chumley, the officers of HMS Seraph, and countless others who had preserved the secrecy of the operation. They learned about how the body was prepared, how the documents were crafted, and how the deception unfolded step by step. And above all, they learned about the strange, profound journey of Glyndwr Michael. The more the story was told, the deeper its impact became. Teachers used it to demonstrate critical thinking. Intelligence officers used it to illustrate the importance of human detail. Historians used it to show the intersection of tragedy and triumph. And ordinary people everywhere found in it a reminder of how unpredictable, fragile, and interconnected human lives can be. As Operation Mincemeat continued to echo through the decades, the world gradually began to understand that this strange, imaginative, and risky deception had been more than just an intelligence trick. It had been a turning point in the war, a convergence of desperation and ingenuity, and a testament to how the smallest details can influence the vast machinery of history. The story's impact stretched far beyond wartime strategy. It became a lens through which future generations examined the nature of truth, deception, sacrifice, and the fragile boundary between life and death. And as historians uncovered more layers, the narrative of Operation Mincemeat deepened, revealing new dimensions that earlier generations had never imagined. In the years following the war, British intelligence carefully guarded the methods used during Mincemeat. Deception had worked so perfectly that its potential continued to be valuable. The files remained classified, protected within locked cabinets and restricted archives. Even within the intelligence community, the full story was known only to a select few. The 20 Committee continued to refine wartime deception strategies, and analysts studied how the interplay of forged documents, human psychology, diplomatic tension, and enemy bias had created the perfect trap. The operation demonstrated that the enemy could be guided not by overwhelming power but by subtle nudges, believable details, and a narrative that fit their own expectations. The power of Operation Mincemeat lay in its meticulous construction. Every part of Major William Martin's life, from the photograph of his fiancée to the ticket stubs in his pocket, had been created to withstand scrutiny. German intelligence officers were trained to be skeptical. They dissected every inconsistency they discovered. But the strength of the deception was that it mirrored the randomness and imperfections of real life. A real man would have forgotten to pay a bill. A real man would have kept a letter from a loved one tucked in his wallet. A real officer on assignment might carry documents that seemed mundane yet hinted at larger operations. The planners of Mincemeat understood that the secret to great deception was not grandeur but ordinary human detail. And it was these details that fooled the Germans so completely. As the story became more widely known, scholars from different fields found different meanings within it. Psychologists saw it as an example of confirmation bias, how people interpret information in ways that support their existing belief. Hitler already suspected the Allies would attack Greece and Sardinia. The documents simply reinforced his expectations. Sociologists viewed mincemeat as a demonstration of how institutions could be manipulated when hierarchical structures discouraged dissent. Some German officers doubted the documents but lacked the authority or courage to challenge their superiors. Ethicists debated whether using a corpse for deception was morally acceptable, even in war. Some argued it was a necessary act that saved countless lives. Others questioned the morality of exploiting a man who had died alone and in poverty. These debates enriched the story, transforming it from a wartime anecdote into an enduring subject of philosophical inquiry. Meanwhile, the coastal town of Huelva in Spain embraced its role in the story. The grave of Major Martin became a quiet pilgrimage site for tourists, historians, and military enthusiasts. Spanish locals, unaware of the operation's full details for decades, took pride in the idea that their small town had been a crossroads of one of the most daring intelligence operations of the war. The cemetery workers tended the grave with care, placing flowers and maintaining the headstone. When the grave was updated to include the name of Glyndwr Michael, the revelation brought a new layer of meaning. Visitors began to see the grave not just as a memorial to a fictional officer but as a symbol of a man whose tragic life had been transformed into an act of global significance. Throughout the late 20th century, new documents continued to emerge, revealing the internal tensions and emotional struggles faced by those who orchestrated the operation. Letters from Ewan Montagu revealed how he wrestled with the ethical weight of the plan. While proud of its success, he later admitted that he often thought about the man whose body had made everything possible. He wondered about Glyndwr Michael's final moments, about the life he had lived before fate placed him at the center of a historical turning point. Montagu's reflections demonstrated the human cost underlying even the most brilliant operations, reminding future generations that intelligence work is often built upon moral ambiguity. Chumley, equally brilliant but more eccentric, also carried the weight of the operation throughout his life. He was a man who thrived on unconventional thinking, and mincemeat had been the perfect outlet for his creativity. Yet as he aged, he too expressed unease about the anonymity and obscurity of Glyndwr Michael's life. In private notes, he wrote that the operation had succeeded because it had been crafted with care, respect, and attention to detail, but he acknowledged that they had relied on the life of a man who had been all but forgotten in the world. For Chumley, this became a constant reminder of the responsibility carried by intelligence officers. As the operation became public knowledge, journalists and researchers dug deeper. They discovered notes from the medical staff who prepared the body, describing the challenges of preserving it and making it appear as if it had died from drowning. Naval records showed how the crew of HMS Seraph had reacted with solemn reverence when they released the body into the Mediterranean. They described the cold night air, the quiet sea, and the eerie sense that they were committing a body to a mission rather than a grave. These moments painted a vivid picture of the emotional burden shared by those who had been closest to the operation. Over time, Operation Mincemeat became a story about more than deception. It became a lesson in how human psychology can be leveraged to shape global events. Hitler's decision to move troops away from Sicily had not been forced by overwhelming military power, it had been guided by a carefully crafted illusion. German intelligence analysts who examined the documents had been convinced not through fear or intimidation but through a believable narrative that fit their expectations. The operation illustrated how wars are often fought in the minds of military leaders, where perception can matter more than reality. In the broader context of World War II, Operation Mincemeat became a symbol of Allied ingenuity. It highlighted how the Allies compensated for their weaknesses through brilliance in strategy, code-breaking, and deception. It complemented other major deception operations, including those that preceded D-Day. Collectively, these operations demonstrated that the success of the Allies was not solely due to industrial strength or manpower, but also to the ingenuity and creativity of their intelligence services. As the decades passed, the story continued to evolve. New generations encountered it through books, museum exhibits, films, and documentaries. People were captivated by the idea that one man, dead and unknown, had helped save thousands of lives. They were moved by the way ordinary items, like letters and receipts, had become tools of war. They were fascinated by the intricate dance of espionage, diplomacy, and military planning that had converged in a single moment on a lonely Spanish beach. By the early 21st century, the story had become deeply embedded in public consciousness. Intelligence experts discussed it in lectures around the world. Universities included it in courses on military history, ethics, and intelligence studies. Writers explored its themes in fiction and nonfiction, using it as a foundation for broader reflections on deception and truth. The operation inspired countless creative works, each adding new depth to the story while reinforcing its place in history. Yet perhaps the most profound part of the operation's legacy was the transformation of Glyndwr Michael's memory. Once destined to fade into anonymity, he became a symbol of silent sacrifice. He became a reminder that even those who feel forgotten may leave an impact greater than they could ever imagine. His grave, once a tombstone for a fictional officer, became a monument to a man whose life, though marked by hardship, had shaped the world in ways he would never know. In this way, Operation Mincemeat lived on not only as a victorious wartime deception but as a deeply human story, a story about ingenuity, sacrifice, unintended heroism, and the strange ways in which history is shaped by those who never planned to shape it at all. As the 21st century unfolded, Operation Mincemeat continued to transcend its origins as a wartime deception and evolved into one of the most remarkable stories of human ingenuity ever recorded. The operation's legacy spread through museums, academic institutions, military archives, documentary films, and newly declassified intelligence files that shed light on details long hidden from the public. With each passing year, new layers of the story were uncovered, adding nuance and depth to what had already been a legendary tale. The world began to see that Operation Mincemeat was not simply an act of wartime trickery but a profound reflection on the intersection of creativity, sacrifice, secrecy, and the unpredictable course of history. As intelligence agencies modernized their techniques, they continued to look to mincemeat as the foundational lesson in operational deception. The operation had proven that even the most powerful enemy could be misled not with overwhelming force but with the careful manipulation of perception. Intelligence officers studied how psychological biases could be exploited, how narrative consistency could create emotional credibility, and how the smallest elements of everyday life could serve as powerful illusionary tools. The operation became a case study in how intelligence work requires not just logic and precision but also empathy, the ability to think like the enemy, predict their reactions, and craft stories that resonate with their fears, expectations, and assumptions. As new declassified files surfaced, they revealed the extraordinary level of coordination required to bring the operation to life. Naval memos detailed how HMS Seraph altered its routine to avoid suspicion. Medical reports described the challenges of preserving the body in a way that would withstand forensic scrutiny. Diplomatic correspondence showed how British officials in Spain coordinated their concerns about the missing documents, carefully structuring their panic to appear genuine. Each department, the Navy, the Army, MI5, MI6, the Foreign Office, had contributed a vital component, weaving a web of authenticity that ultimately ensnared the German High Command. What made the operation truly extraordinary, however, was the level of attention given to human detail. Intelligence planners did not focus solely on military document. They crafted a life. They created memories for a man who no longer had any. They built a narrative that spoke to the humanity of their target audience. The love letters, the personal photographs, the casual correspondence, these were not simply prop. They were the psychological anchors that convinced German intelligence they were reading the private papers of a real officer. This understanding of human vulnerability, that even the most hardened analysts can be influenced by emotion and familiarity, became a guiding principle in modern psychological operations. As interest in World War II resurged, Operation Mincemeat became a subject of renewed scholarly and cultural attention. Museums curated exhibits showcasing replicas of the documents, the wallet, the uniform, and the fateful briefcase. They displayed transcripts of decrypted messages showing how German divisions shifted their positions, unknowingly responding to a dead man's fictional life. Visitors walked through these exhibits silently, absorbing the magnitude of the deception and the fragility of the line between truth and illusion in wartime. Authors and filmmakers revisited the story repeatedly, each retelling adding a contemporary lens to the narrative. Some told it as a thriller, emphasizing the suspense and secrecy of the operation. Others focused on the ethical dilemmas, the identity of GLYNDWR Michael, and the moral implications of using a human body as a strategic asset. Some works portrayed Montague as a mastermind, Chumley as an eccentric genius, and the corpse as an unintended hero. Others presented the operation more quietly, as a small but profound example of how forgotten lives can become woven into the vast tapestry of history. Readers from around the world responded to these retellings with fascination. They were captivated by the strangeness of the mission, the skill of the planners, and the tragic dignity of the man at its center. They found themselves contemplating how fate can elevate a life once destined for obscurity into a legacy that shapes nations. Many wrote letters to newspapers and museums expressing their admiration for the operation's ingenuity and their empathy for GLYNDWR Michael. His story resonated with people because it represented the silent contributions of countless individuals who never lived to see the impact of their sacrifices. In academia, the operation inspired extensive debate and analysis. Historians argued about the degree to which mincemeat accelerated the fall of Sicily or shaped the Italian campaign. Intelligence scholars examined its influence on Cold War deception tactics, pointing out how both NATO and the Warsaw Pact studied the operation's method. Philosophy professors used the operation as a case study in discussions about ethics and morality during wartime. Students in forensic science courses examined the challenges faced by the medical staff who prepared the body, while those studying political psychology analyzed Hitler's susceptibility to deception. Even as academic analysis deepened, the operation continued to inspire broader conversations about the nature of truth in an age increasingly defined by information warfare, propaganda, and digital deception. Operation Mincemeat showed that misinformation was not a modern invention, it had always been part of conflict. But it also demonstrated that the most effective deceptions were grounded not in chaos but in carefully constructed order. The modern world, faced with rapid advances in technology, looked back on mincemeat as a reminder that the core of deception remained unchanged: Understanding the Human Mind. Among intelligence professionals, mincemeat became a benchmark by which all deception operations were measured. It represented the ideal, an operation that achieved strategic objectives with minimal risk and maximum impact, executed with precision and artistry. Its success was so complete that even decades later, intelligence agencies emphasized the importance of studying it. They recognized that deception could never rely solely on falsehood. It must be built on a foundation of truth so intricate that the fabricated elements blend seamlessly into reality. As the world reflected on Operation Mincemeat, the story of Glyndwr Michael continued to grow in emotional significance. Researchers uncovered details of his life that revealed the quiet tragedies he endured, the poverty, the loss, the desperation. They discovered how he had drifted through life unnoticed, ultimately dying alone in London. And they realized that his unintentional role in history offered a profound commentary on the value of every life, no matter how overlooked. His name, once unknown, became a symbol of how even those who feel invisible may leave an extraordinary mark on the world. In Huelva, the grave of Major William Martin became a place of quiet reverence. Visitors from Britain, Spain, and many other countries left flowers and notes at the site, thanking him for his service, though the man buried beneath the soil had never worn a uniform in life. When researchers revealed his true name, the grave was updated with an inscription honoring both his fictional role and his true identity. The dual names symbolized the dual legacy he carried, the identity he had lived with, and the identity that changed the world. The Spanish cemetery where he lay became a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder that history often unfolds in unexpected places. The locals, who had once tended the grave without knowing its significance, now did so with pride. They understood that their town had played a part in an operation that shaped the future of Europe. As time passed, every participant in Operation Mincemeat grew old, retired, and eventually passed away. Their stories, once held in silence, were finally told through declassified documents, memoirs, and interviews. And as new generations learned about their ingenuity and courage, the operation took on an almost mythic quality. Yet beneath the myth was a simple truth, that Operation Mincemeat had been created by ordinary people working together under extraordinary pressure, driven by the desire to save lives and win a war. The farther the world moved from World War II, the more the operation stood out as a beacon of strategic brilliance. It showed that one well-constructed narrative, delivered at the right moment, could shift military strategy, alter battlefield outcomes, and change the path of history. It showed that even in the darkest moments of conflict, human creativity could illuminate a path toward victory. In the end, Operation Mincemeat became a story about the power of imagination, the complexity of moral choices, and the profound impact of forgotten individuals. It taught the world that history is shaped not only by generals and politicians but also by those whose names appear only briefly in the archive, or not at all. It demonstrated that even in death, a single person can influence the lives of millions. And as long as the story is told, in classrooms, in museums, in films, in quiet reflections at the grave in Huelva, the legacy of Operation Mincemeat will continue to remind the world that truth can be shaped, perception can be guided, and that sometimes the course of war can hinge on the extraordinary journey of an ordinary man. As generations passed and the memory of World War II gradually transformed from lived experience into historical record, the story of Operation Mincemeat remained one of the most unusual and astonishing examples of wartime ingenuity. It stood apart from battles, invasions, and military campaigns because its essence lay not in firepower or strategy but in imagination, empathy, and the strange ability of a constructed story to overpower the machinery of war. The operation's influence was felt long after its details became public knowledge, lingering as a reminder that victory is often shaped not only by armies but by the ideas and decisions of a few determined individuals working silently in the shadows. and as the world moved through new eras of conflict, diplomacy, and technological change, Operation Mincemeat continued to teach lessons about perception, vulnerability, and the complexity of human belief. In modern intelligence communities, the operation became a benchmark, studied by analysts tasked with navigating an increasingly complex landscape of misinformation, cyber warfare, psychological manipulation, and digital espionage. They saw in Mincemeat a blueprint for how narratives could influence military decisions, shape policy, and mislead even the most well-equipped adversaries. Senior officers reminded new recruits that technology alone cannot guarantee success. Rather, the heart of effective deception lies in understanding human psychology. The planners of Mincemeat did not rely on overwhelming force. They relied on insight, the knowledge that the enemy would believe something if it aligned with their fears and assumptions. This lesson remained just as relevant in an age of satellites and encrypted networks as it had been in 1943. At the same time, historians began to explore the operation from fresh angles, drawing connections between its success and the broader evolution of intelligence strategy. They noted how Mincemeat marked a shift in the Allied approach to war, from purely military engagements to holistic strategies that wove together espionage, code-breaking, logistical manipulation, and psychological warfare. They traced how operations like Mincemeat laid the groundwork for later deceptions, such as those used before D-Day, where phantom armies, fake tanks, and fabricated radio transmissions created the illusion of an invasion far from Normandy. Scholars recognized that the brilliant simplicity of the Mincemeat plan had become the catalyst for an entirely new field of military thinking, one that valued misdirection as highly as strength. At the same time, social historians saw in Mincemeat a deeply human story. They reflected on how the operation centered around the life and death of Glynndwr Michael, a man who had lived on the margins of society. They observed how his story symbolized the countless invisible lives that shaped history without ever knowing it. His life, marked by poverty and loneliness, had seemed destined to fade into obscurity, yet in death he became a silent figure whose existence altered the movements of armies, the decisions of generals, and the fate of nations. His transformation from an anonymous, forgotten man to an integral part of a global turning point raised questions about the nature of legacy and how the most unexpected individuals can have the greatest impact. Visitors who traveled to Huelva often described a sense of quiet reverence as they approached the cemetery where Major William Martin, and more importantly Glynndwr Michael, lay buried. The headstone bearing both names symbolized two intertwined identities, one fictional, one real, both essential to the story of Operation Mincemeat. Flowers placed at the grave came from people who had been moved by the story, from students who had read about the operation in class, from tourists fascinated by espionage history, and from veterans who recognized the immeasurable contribution the man in the grave had made. Over time, the grave became more than a simple resting place. It became a monument to the idea that every life, no matter how quiet or troubled, carries weight in the world. Documentarians and writers delved into the emotional and psychological challenges faced by those who planned the operation. They uncovered journals describing the strain of maintaining secrecy, the fear that any small detail might unravel the plan, and the deep sense of responsibility the planners felt toward the man whose body they had used. These documents revealed how the operation was not a detached act of cold calculation but a deeply human endeavor filled with moral questions, personal doubts, and profound emotional burdens. Intelligence officers often wrote about feeling torn between duty and conscience, between the strategic necessity of deception and the personal discomfort of using a human body as a weapon. Their reflections added dimension to the operation, reminding the world that even the most brilliant deception came with a cost. Moreover, families of the men who orchestrated the operation shared memories passed down through generations, recollections of fathers or grandfathers who rarely spoke about their wartime roles but carried an unspoken heaviness. Many had held on to silence because they were bound by secrecy. Others remained quiet because they struggled with their memories. As these recollections surfaced, people discovered that the architects of mincemeat had never seen themselves as heroes. They viewed their work as one part of a vast and terrible necessity, performed not for glory but because it had to be done. Their humility mirrored the quiet dignity of the man whose identity they had used. As new waves of declassification continued into the 21st century, previously unseen details emerged about how the operation had influenced not only the invasion of Sicily but also broader Allied strategy in Europe. Documents revealed how German redeployments caused by mincemeat weakened defensive lines in Italy, delayed reinforcements to Sicily, and forced Germany to expend resources on fortifications that would never be attacked. Intelligence summaries described how German command structures became entangled in the illusion, partly due to Hitler's increasing distrust of his own officers and growing belief in elaborate Allied feint. These revelations deepened understanding of how the deception had cascaded through the German war machine, altering the flow of the conflict far more than contemporary observers had realized. At the same time, the operation's influence extended into cultural memory. Writers used mincemeat as inspiration for novels, plays, and films exploring themes of identity, deception, sacrifice, and truth. Philosophers pointed to the story when examining questions about the nature of authenticity. Artists represented the operation through symbolic works, paintings depicting a drifting body beneath a moonlit sky, sculptures representing the dual identities of William Martin and Glyndwr Michael, musical compositions capturing the tension and sorrow of the mission. The operation transcended its military origins and became a cultural phenomenon that spoke to universal human themes. In schools and universities, teachers introduced Operation Mincemeat to illustrate how history often turns on the most unexpected event. Students learned that while battles are often won by armies on the field, wars can be shaped by the imagination of unseen thinkers whose names are rarely remembered. Professors emphasized that the story demonstrated the importance of critical thinking, the consequences of confirmation bias, and the dangerous simplicity of assuming that the most obvious explanation is always correct. They invited students to analyze how the deception played into Hitler's misconceptions, how it leveraged diplomatic tension in Spain, and how it showcased the power of storytelling as a force in world events. Yet despite its success, Operation Mincemeat also became a subject of ethical reflection. Ethicists and theologians questioned the morality of manipulating the body of a deceased person. They debated whether the ends justified the means, even in a war as devastating as World War II. Some argued that the operation saved countless lives by shortening the war and reducing casualties during the invasion of Sicily. Others argued that respect for the dead should never be compromised, even in wartime. These discussions added philosophical depth to the story and challenged new generations to consider the ethical complexities behind wartime decisions. In intelligence circles, analysts continued to examine mincemeat not only as a historical success but also as a potential cautionary tale. Some warned that reliance on deception can create vulnerabilities if used improperly. They pointed out that success requires perfect coordination, precise timing, and a deep understanding of enemy psychology. They noted that any misstep, a single inconsistency, an error in tone, a misjudgment in timing, could have exposed the operation and endangered the invasion. The success of mincemeat, they argued, should be seen not as proof that deception is easy but as evidence of how difficult it is to execute flawlessly. As part of its evolving legacy, Operation Mincemeat became intertwined with larger questions about the nature of history itself. Historians observed that people often imagine history as a chain of major events, battles, treaties, speeches, revolutions, but mincemeat demonstrated that quiet acts performed in secret can shape the world just as profoundly. The story challenged traditional ideas of heroism, showing that bravery can take many forms and that the most significant acts of courage are not always performed on the battlefield. The operation also offered a meditation on fate. Glynndwr Michael, a man who had lived his life unnoticed, became an unlikely figure in shaping the outcome of a global conflict. His journey from anonymity to historical significance served as a reminder that destiny can take unexpected forms. His legacy became a testament to how the smallest and most fragile threads of human experience can become woven into the vast fabric of history. In the end, Operation Mincemeat stood as one of the greatest examples of how imagination can shape reality. It was a story that began with tragedy, unfolded with ingenuity, and concluded with a legacy that reached far beyond the war it helped win. It showed that even in humanity's darkest moments, creativity remains one of its most powerful weapons. It revealed that history is not predetermined but shaped by countless decisions, risks, and leaps of faith. And it served as a reminder that the actions of ordinary people, whether in life or in death, can leave an extraordinary mark on the world. Operation Mincemeat remains a story not only of war but of humanity, reflecting the brilliant, fragile, and unpredictable nature of the human spirit. It continues to endure because it touches something universal, the belief that even in chaos, truth can be shaped by those who dare to imagine, and the world can be changed by those whom history might otherwise have forgotten.